Welcome to She Persisted. I'm your host, Sadie Sutton. Every Friday, I post interviews about mental health, dialectical behavioral therapy, and teenage life. These episodes break down my mental health journey, teach skills to help you cope with life, and showcase testimonials from individuals, including teens just like you. Whether you've struggled yourself or just want to improve your mental fitness, this podcast is your inspiration to live a life you love and keep persisting. This week on She Persisted.
Addiction and mental health problems, they don't occur out of a vacuum. They're not genetic. They occur out of a context. They occur out of family systems. For that parent to become aware of those impossible situations that they've created for their children, and to understand why they've snapped, to understand why they've withdrawn, to understand why they have escaped. All of the research shows that more empathetic, more kind of non-directive, non-controlling techniques and the therapeutic bond itself, more than any particular modality, is what creates good outcomes.
This week's DBT skill is the chain analysis skill. A chain analysis is a way to examine your problem behaviors to figure out what prompted them, how you could have been more effective with your skills usage, and understand how that problem behavior had consequences in your life. The first thing we're going to look at is your vulnerability going into the interaction. If you are hungry, not well slept, if you have been lacking on getting exercise and moving, so that's also impacting your physical health. These are all things that could make you more vulnerable to being reactive rather than responsive. Other things that could lead to vulnerability are if you are already sensitive about a certain topic, you are feeling already emotionally aroused and distressed, so you're more reactive. The next thing we're going to look at is your trigger. What caused the problem behavior? What was the problematic event that then led to this behavior happening? At this point, you can also go ahead and describe what happened when you engaged in this problematic behavior. Was it an argument you got into? Was a comment that was made? What behavior did you engage in? Kind of breaking that down. Who, what, when, where, why, how. Doing the same thing for the triggering event. Next thing we're going to do is look at the links in our chain analysis. These are all the things that happened between the triggering event and your problem behavior where you could have potentially implemented skills. If you were getting in an argument with someone and you're looking at the chain of events where you're both going back and forth and saying things, you could have potentially implemented some deep breathing or pausing and taking a step back, maybe some validation. So that's a quick example of how you can implement it. From there, we're going to look at what happened after this interaction. Going back to this argument example, did you have to repair the relationship? Was that person treating you differently for a couple of days because of that argument? Did you have a negative mood for the next couple of hours due to the argument? We're going to look at all of these things and figure out how it impacted your life. So that's a chain analysis. You're able to better understand why and how you engaged in problematic behaviors and how in the future you can implement different skills to avoid engaging in that behavior. Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode. I'm so excited for this episode. I just have to start off with that. This might be my favorite episode that I've ever recorded. It is just phenomenal. Every single second is filled with value and insight, and I just left this conversation being like, oh my gosh. So before we get into that, kind of unpacking this week a little bit, doing a little bit of a check-in moment, I went back to school for the first time since we went into lockdown. Over a year later, I'm finally going back for the first day of my senior year in person, and it was so much fun. I am so much more engaged and have a better mood. I'm feeling more energized and productive, being able to get up and go places and still do all these things that I love. And so I'm really happy to be back at school. So I don't want to make this intro too long because I want to have this episode be as much about this interview as possible. So we're going to dive into our Q&As really quick and then we'll jump right in. First question was, how do you work on your habits? I talked about this a little bit last week about how I'm working to improve my self-discipline by setting reinforcements that make me excited, whether that's visuals or to-do lists, checkboxes, things that may bring me a lot of joy, but aren't necessarily significant to someone else. And the next thing is to set measurable goals at certain dates. So my goal for this past week was to do 2 workouts. So I said, okay, by Friday at 6 p.m., I'll do 1 workout, and by Tuesday at 4 p.m., I'll do the second workout. And I could go over that. I could do more than 1 workout, and I ended up doing 4 workouts last week, and I still met my goal on the time frame. And so that was something that was really enjoyable and effective as far as habits. I think the biggest tip is to be really aware of the habits that you're tracking. And I do this in my bullet journal where I write down what habits I'm tracking every month, whether that's getting up out of bed at a certain time or getting to sleep and unplugging at a certain time, things like that, or studying for a certain number of hours, whatever it is that I'm trying to increase or decrease. Having them in front of you and checking in on them daily is a great reminder to build those habits and also keep track of where you're at with them. So, adding check ins in your planner or having them on your schedule, different ways where you're visually reminded to practice these habits and check in on how you're doing with them, is really effective. And then the last tip I'll give on this is to try and build habits that you enjoy. I think anything that we do, if we don't get value from it or enjoy it, it's really hard to get any energy from it and want to continue doing it and have the change be long lasting. So even if it's something like studying, having it be associated with something fun, like after you study for an hour, you'll reward yourself by watching a certain TV episode, and you'll only watch that TV show when you've studied. So kind of pairing it with things that are enjoyable, or making studying fun if you really like visuals, doing like thought maps, that kind of thing, so it is enjoyable for you and it's not just another task that you have to get done that you'll eventually end up avoiding. Next question is advice on being sad about leaving your friends in college. Totally relate to this one. I am definitely very excited to go to college in the fall, or actually this summer, in August, but I'm definitely nervous. I've made a lot of really great friendships here, and I'm sad to miss everyone. I also have moved to boarding school and then moved back home and had to kind of let go of those relationships. And I think what I keep coming back to is that when you've built a really strong friendship, and you've built a healthy relationship, and you have confidence in that and trust, and it's a great relationship on both sides, you're able to re-enter interactions and it feels like no time has passed. You can call them up, you can visit them, and your friendship is just as strong, and it feels like no time has gone by. So I think my advice relating to that would be partially having trust that you'll still be able to see these people and have these interactions that you love, and being able to support them and be connected, and also focusing on just continuing to strengthen that rather than suffering twice and being overwhelmed by the anxiety and apprehension about what if you aren't friends anymore and you don't talk at all, and then when that eventually happens, you've gone through that emotional experience twice. And then my second piece of advice is that, especially with something like college, where there are so many different people from all over that you'll get along with or you won't get along with, you will find your people, you will find your tribe, you will find your community. So regardless of what happens with your friends at home, you're gonna find some amazing relationships and some amazing friendships, and those can really come into your life in a way that you're feeling the loss from your other friends. So I think really diving into that, working on building those relationships rather than staying attached to other friends that are kind of have moved away or are in different parts of the country at school. And of course, not to say that you shouldn't keep in touch with people or call them or anything like that, but I think one of the way that I'm going to approach college is to really, really work on building my relationships while there and building great friendships that I can have for the next 4 years. So that is all the questions that I'm going to answer this week. So diving into this week's interview, today's guest is Evan Haines. Evan is the co-founder of Alo House and a leader in the compassionate care model, as well as being a very active member in the recovery community. After his own journey to sobriety, he now works with individuals to help them obtain and maintain sobriety through compassion rather than control. So if you guys want to check out more of Evan's work, you can go to allorecovery.com or follow him on Instagram at It's Evan Haines. And as always, links to anything mentioned by Evan and Alo House and all of these amazing resources will be in today's show notes. So without further ado, let's jump into this episode. Thank you so much for joining me today on She Persisted.
Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So, can you tell me a little bit about you and your story? What led you to becoming sober and working in the recovery industry?
Yeah, so I've been alive for like 46 years, and I guess I've been sober for about 15. So I was 30 when I realized my life was falling apart a little bit, or at least it wasn't going the way I maybe felt it should. And I'll back up a little bit, but to sort of set it up in a non-linear kind of Quentin Tarantino uh, movie type thing. Imagine I'm in jail in LA County jail, and I've imagined maybe there's been some horrible mistake, although, I had kind of come to out of a blackout in handcuffs on a curb after a car accident where I'd hit a car with a person in it. And I mean, thank God nobody was hurt.
Yeah.
I could have killed somebody. And that was kind of where I was at. That's what my life had kind of come to. I'm a nice guy. I'm sort of intelligent, and that was kind of the best I could do. So backing up and kind of telling you how, at least I think I got there. I grew up, I think, like a lot of families do nowadays, in a home where there were people suffering from mental health problems, addiction problems, divorce. Some of the things I think we think are normal, it turns out can be difficult for a child and for maybe a sensitive child like myself. I was an only child, definitely introverted, shy, and I grew up visiting my mom in psychiatric hospitals. She was a wonderful woman. She was highly intelligent,
Mhm.
hilarious, one of the most incredible artists maybe ever. This beautiful, stylish, unique person, and she struggled. She had her difficulties in childhood, and when I was 14, she took her life. And I remember, I mean, literally the day before, you know, just despite all these adversities, I was still fairly solid. I had a good group of friends. I was actually at a birthday party, and I remember I wanted to stay overnight. And we were having a pool party and pizza and watching movies. And I called my dad. My parents had been split up, and I called my dad to ask if I could stay over. And he says,
Mhm.
you need to come home. We're going to come pick you up, him and my stepmom. And somehow I was sitting out there in the curb, and I just knew it. I
Your
knew my
heart
mom.
dropped and
I,
yeah.
I just knew before they got there. I knew what happened.
Mhm.
I knew she was dead, and I loved her. I mean, we were very close. I would live with her on the weekends,
Mhm.
and we'd go see movies and go to McDonald's and go to the park and just hang out and watch TV. We were really close,
Mhm.
and I knew it. And my dad told me, and I think I'd lost my grandma like a year before, where I'd cried and bawled. My
Yeah.
grandma was really this rock for me, and was so loving and stable. But by the time my mom died, I remember even at her funeral, I didn't shed a tear, I didn't cry, I was just shut down. I shut down.
Mhm.
And
So
almost
I
the next
wonder, you talked about being super sensitive, and I'm wondering if you were as sensitive when you were grieving that second time, or it was just completely internalized?
well, 100%, and it was just too much. It was just too much.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't cry until I was, like, 35 years old. I mean, I might have cried once, but I mean,
Mhm.
bawled, like, sort of
Yeah.
appropriately for something so painful. I was telling a friend who had suffered from mental health problems, who had attempted suicide a few times, and that she'd survived. And I was
Mhm.
telling her, and I started reading her this letter that our family doctor had written me about me and my mom, and I could feel it coming up. And I was like, oh my gosh, as I'm talking, I
What
just
is
started
this? Yeah.
bawling.
Mhm.
I bawled like that recently. Alexis, who you know, and we'd
Mhm.
done a staycation at the Four Seasons near our house. I guess that was Valentine's Day, so February. Watch this movie if you ever have a chance, called Paris, Texas, directed by Wim Wenders. And there's this scene at the end where this mother is reunited with her son, and my mom was. I mean, I can get chills just thinking about it. And I
Mhm.
asked Alexa. She turned around and I'm bawling. I did it
She's like,
again.
"What is
So
going
so I
on?"
exactly. She'd never seen me cry in my life, and I did it
Mhm.
again. Just what was that, a month? Not even a month or two ago.
Mhm.
So, though not knowing how to deal with these feelings from that age, where I'm literally calling like my bad friends, my sort of like emo friends, the next day after that, I'm with my mm, sure goody goody friends one day and my sort of goth emo friends the next
Mhm.
day. And that just kind of set me off. It was cigarettes, it was weed, it was LSD, and it was alcohol and ephedrine pills and whatever. But I mean, I went to school, I went to college. Things started definitely falling apart by the time I was supposed to write my master's thesis, and I kind of struggled with that. I turned a 2-year master's program into like a 6-year ordeal. But then I moved to LA, and I didn't know I had a problem until honestly I moved here. I'd Before that accident, I drove drunk frequently, and I would drive up against a bunch of parked cars, and I mean, I was a mess. It was just a
Mhm.
total mess, and I lost any sense of, you know, the kind of things that matter, or just a sense of passion or values or wonder, awe. All these things I think are kind of essential to our mental health, and certainly a sense of belonging and a sense of being safe, or a sense of, I don't even know what necessarily what these things are, except I know when I feel them.
It's like living.
Um,
You're either
it's
moving
like
through the
living.
motions or you're living.
You're living, and my life, I think, had become really just so one dimensional. And so I was sentenced by a judge to AA. And I remember like my first meeting, and there was a girl speaking at the podium, and just the way she talked and the words she was using. And I was like looking around, there was all these other cool people. And I'm like, these are my people. And I
Mhm,
found my people, all these other people just like me. And it felt great. I mean, it took me another 5 years to kind of, like, find my people, so anyone who was in recovery, who's in AA, who maybe doesn't like the meetings, my advice is to keep looking,
mhm.
and, eventually, when I found that crew of people, those are still my best friends to this day. That was 10 years ago. That was where I met Alexis, out of that community, and my life just kinda blossomed, and that's where we started, Alo House at the time, about 10 years ago. In fact, June 1st, it'll have been ten years.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That it's very interesting, and I kinda wanna ask you about that community aspect of it. I've heard so many times that it's crucial for recovery, and you say you found, like, your true community years later. Do you think that your initial community was just as beneficial in your journey, and then you had different needs that were met later on, or it was you just waited to find your people for a while?
That's a really good question. I know it was kind of like that in the beginning, like, that first meeting I went to, it was like celebrities, it was like cool people. They were never I mean, I could have done more to kind of reach out or try to make
Mhm,
friends, but I never felt totally welcomed. Things weren't clicking.
mhm,
It was enough that for whatever it was, an hour a day, an hour and a half a day, I could immerse myself. I eventually started going to, like, say, a men's meeting where, you would sit in a circle and everyone would share. So for the first year,
mhm.
I didn't say a word, and I would go, but I would listen to speakers, these, like, really, like, inspiring, uplifting speakers, and that was kind of enough. And then I went to the men's groups where I could share. I had to, and then I started making friends or someone, to take me through the steps, or I would go out for lunch after or go for coffee after. Really wasn't until that kind of 5 year mark. And I think I'd had like an AA sponsor at the time who said, you really got to go get a commitment. And I think I was moving to Malibu, and I found this meeting that was outside at this Franciscan monastery overlooking the ocean with the mountains all around you under the blue sky. And I was like, I'm going to go to that meeting. And I asked the old guy who used to set it up. I said, hey, can I have a commitment? He goes, yeah, sure. You can set up the chairs. So I would go like every day and set up the chairs. And then, what's funny? That's where I met my friends and eventually met Alexis, but that wasn't quite it. The catalyst was it was before we started Aloe House. Basically, my life fell apart. Jared, my business partner here, my best friend, and we like lost everything. We were in the film business, and we failed like in this kind of ball of flames, and just went down and lost all the money we had, and this idea we were going to make a movie, and it totally um, just disappeared. And so then I really dove in. I dove in and I would share about this honestly, that, well, my life's falling apart, but I'm not going to drink or use about it. And here I am. And people started, the first time ever, someone would come and ask me to take them through the steps. And I was like, oh my God, like I finally really, after five
Mhm,
years, it took, understood what kind of AA was about. And that's fine. I mean, no one, anyone who's kind of in early recovery, I don't think needs to necessarily worry about sort of timelines or what they're supposed to do.
mhm,
I mean, really, AA didn't start like that. It wasn't about that. It was about community. It was just about being with other people. So to answer your question, it's a great question. I think that my needs must have increased, and especially at that crisis point, because just because you're sober doesn't mean bad things aren't going to happen. And
yeah,
here I am. I'm in recovery. I'm sober, and I'm having a total crisis. My whole world's falling apart. Then I needed to dive in. And it turned out as I dove in, I became more useful. Really, what it was is I found out I wasn't that kind of identity who I thought I was. I thought I was this kind of sober guy who's now going to be a filmmaker and all these things that I thought kind of made me what I was and gave me my value. It turned out that those things weren't what I was, and what I was someone who could, no matter what I was going through, still kind of be there for other people, that in that we can kind of go through these things together. And
Hmm.
that's what it was.
Totally. So you mentioned early recovery versus when you've been sober for a while, and I wanted to ask kind of a two-part question, one being
Mm,
what the early recovery is like, that emotional experience, and then when that shift takes place,
mm,
what's so different? When are you finally past that threshold where you're like, I'm no longer early recovered, I've made it, I'm sober,
mm.
and I've been this way for a while. What's that difference?
It's a really good question. So I remember I was obviously sentenced to AA, but I happened to like it. Like I would take my court card to get signed after the meeting, and it's for the people who have to go, not the people who want to
Mhm.
go. But I would say, no, 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 I want to be here. I know you're signing this, but don't worry, I'll be here. They're like, oh, okay, like we don't care. And and then so I felt at home, and I never would have thought I could do that for 15 years. That's for
Yeah.
sure. Maybe a year. I mean, I wasn't, honestly wasn't, I guess, thinking like that. I thought, though, I remember before I even went to my first meeting, I thought, if I can just learn to be comfortable in social situations, that would be huge. That
Mhm.
would be huge. And then after kind of going to those first meetings, I'm seeing people putting away chairs or talking to new people or doing all making coffee, whatever it was, and I thought I added one more goal. I thought if I could just learn to be useful. So I had these sort of twin goals. If I could be comfortable in social situations and be useful, that maybe I would stick around to sort of see what happens.
Mhm.
And that's what I did. And I stuck around, and I guess both of those things happened. So when did it change? When did I know I was, like, in the clear? It's different. It's gonna be different for everyone. Like,
Mhm.
not everyone kinda goes to their first meeting and is like, "I'm home." Like, I mean, I remember before I went to my first meeting even, the morning after my last night drinking where I had, like, cleared a table of food at a Mel's Diner and was trying to fight everybody, and I was in bare feet and I was diving into bushes and stuff like that. My friend walks into my bedroom the next morning and he's recounting all these things I did. And I'm like, oh my God, I did do that, didn't I? And this was only a week, by the way, after I'd been arrested and gone to LA
Mhm.
County jail. So, and where I remember telling my cellmate in jail, I said, I think I have a problem. I think I got to switch
Mhm.
to beer. And I did, and I did the first night I was out, and the second night, and the third night I had a shot at the bar, and it's kind of the last thing I remember. And so my friend walks in, he tells me all these things, and he goes, "I think you're an alcoholic." And I was like, "I am an alcoholic." Like, and I was like relieved. I was like calling people, like, "Guess what? I'm an alcoholic." Like, I was happy that I finally had like a word for this
It's
thing
so
that I was.
validating. You're
It's
like,
so
"It's not in my
validating
head." Mhm.
that there's like something I can like kind of identify or attached to, that there's a vocabulary that I can
Mhm.
use to talk about what's happening, and I still think that's true. So it's it's not going to be like that. I know there's people who struggle, and so I've never had like I I'd never had like a relapse per se, where I know people who have and they struggle and they're kind of like back and forth, and that kind of almost becomes their thing. So my version of it, may not kind of work for everyone. I happened to like get it right away
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and loved it.
Yeah. This week's episode is brought to you by Sakara. You guys know how much I'm stressing the importance of good sleep, good nutrition, getting outside, staying active, because when we don't take care of our physical health, our mental health truly suffers as well. I know that my emotional vulnerability is off the charts when I'm not taking care of my physical health. I can't be productive, my relationships struggle, and everything just becomes a mess. Sakara is a nutrition company that focuses on overall wellness, starting with what you eat. Their organic, ready to eat meals are made with powerful plant based ingredients, and they're designed to boost your energy, improve digestion, and get your skin glowing. Their meals are delivered all around the US, ready to eat at your door, and you are good to go. They also have some amazing wellness essentials, like one of my favorites, their sleep tea, which I love a good cup of tea before bed to keep my sleep hygiene in check. They also have things like beauty chocolates, like chocolate that you eat to help your skin, like literally mind blown. So many different supplements, teas, powders, granola, all of that kind of stuff. To get your hands on their amazing products, you can go to sakara.com and use code XOSADIE at checkout for 20% off. Again, that's sakara.com. Use code XOSADIE at checkout for 20% off your first order. Kind of a random question, but you said you used drugs as well as drinking.
Mhm.
What makes it so that you identify as an alcoholic and rather as a drug addict, or what kind of helps someone make that
Mhm.
differentiation?
So that's a very good question. I happen to probably drink more than I did drugs. I happen to do drugs. So I identify with like kind of winos or,
Mhm.
alcoholics. I remember I would go to dinner parties and I could drink probably at least a couple bottles of wine and I would get like physically anxious as I watched like those other bottles go down. I'm watching everyone else drink and like we gotta get out of here. Like the liquor store is gonna close. Like
Mhm.
I definitely relate to people who drink alcohol. I know there's people who more so relate to doing drugs. I think, Bill Wilson, who founded AA, happened to, and Dr. Bob, his partner, happened to be alcoholics. But there was also other people, I think, in early AA who did do drugs, and they often went hand in hand. Like where Bill Wilson got sober was a place called Towns Hospital in New York. It was very kind of fancy, and the owner of the facility, Towns, he had some cure. It was called the belladonna cure. It was actually this kind of plant medicine, basically, is what it was, that sent you into like a delirium. And they would administer this cure every hour for like 50 hours.
Oh my
And that's
gosh.
where Bill Wilson had his like white light experience. But I digress. And that belladonna cure was originally meant for like narcotic addicts. And though Towns figured out it also happened to work for alcoholics. So they were treating both those people. But then what happened is people really identify, that AA is for alcoholics. It's finally loosening up now where someone who's maybe doesn't even like alcohol, but they could identify as an alcoholic, go to an AA meeting, find all of the same benefits as they would at, say, an NA meeting.
Yeah.
But the problem is in early AA, maybe not the earliest, but at some point, maybe during the 50s or so,
Mhm.
I don't know exactly when it happened, but they became very exclusive. Like you had to be an alcoholic.
Yeah.
You can't talk about anything else here. They call it outside issues. And some people are still like that. What then ended up happening actually is a guy named Chuck Diedrich, right down here in Santa Monica, got into like a fight with AA. He was like a dope addict. He was a narcotic addict, and he didn't feel welcome at AA. So he went and started this spin-off thing called Synanon, which was actually this
The
really kind of like,
therapeutic boarding schools and troubled teen industry from that.
yes,
Yeah,
you know about that. So
I did.
that's the genesis.
Mhm.
Really, it was the fact that Chuck Diedrich wasn't accepted that led to all of that. Of course, you go way back
Crazy.
into the
Mhm.
history of our mistreatment of people with mental health problems, and
Yeah.
so that's why Chuck Diedrich's approach resonated, is because it,
Yeah.
it contains all of that violence and punishment and control, and seemed perfectly natural. And of course, as we know, as people like Maya Salovitz have beautifully illustrated, how that influence of Chuck Diedrich spread
It's so
from
crazy.
direct lines, from Synanon to Eagleville Hospital in Pennsylvania to
Mhm.
Hazelden, which was Hazelden based on the AA model, basically, but now it's been hijacked by Synanon. And
Yeah.
still to this day, addiction treatment, people don't even know, because they don't know where we've come from. They don't realize the degree to which Synanon has impacted and influenced our field.
It's insane. It's a topic I can just go into for hours because it makes
Mhm.
me so angry, and you're never aware of it unless you've been, like, within the treatment industry and had
Mhm.
those experiences and seen it yourself, because it's totally a hidden world, and unless
It
you
is.
have that emotional connection, you would never be like, "Huh, I wonder what happened there."
And the
Um,
only people that we seem to think it's okay to still use this approach with are poor people and children.
yeah.
You
And
know,
there's
poor
no.
people, poor
Yeah.
people and children of any kind of economic background.
It's terrible. I know right now there's 10,000 kids in troubled teen industry
Yeah,
programs that are signed away because they don't have their own rights as an
yeah,
individual. They're not an adult yet, and it's insane. They can be legally kidnapped and put into these programs for years, and
yeah.
you would never know unless you've known someone that's gone through it.
And parents think that they don't know what to do. They're so
Oh,
lost, and
and
they
I
think
have
that they're helping.
so much
Yeah,
compassion because they're being told what they wanna hear. They're being
yeah,
told, "We can help your child. We
yeah.
see this is not your fault. We've done this before. We can fix this." And that's all they wanna hear is that their kid will be okay. Their worst fears come true,
Yeah.
and someone's giving them the answer. And
And no one, I don't think, and so I'm writing a book right now called America is Addiction, and I've learned so much. I had to learn so much in order to be able to say anything, you know. And so one thing I learned was sort of the history of how we treat people with mental health problems. And what was really interesting was that, so up until about the 1400s, leprosy was a big problem in Europe. There was
Mhm.
19,000 of these leprosaria around Christian Europe, where, you know, it was like a charity. We would help these people, we would keep them contained, but it was also redemptive, that our helping them would somehow redeem us. That it was both like kind of a sign of God's kind of punishment of them, which is this awful theory that, like, you know, bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good
Yeah.
people. Well, if they have leprosy, well, they must have done something wrong, right? Which is the uh, anyone who thinks that hasn't read like the book of Job, for example, that it's more complicated than that, of course. So these leprosaria, somehow around in the middle of the 1400s, leprosy was kind of cured. It kind of went away. These leprosaria were working, they were keeping it isolated, and it went away. And now they had these empty, 19,000 empty leprosaria. Well, it took 150, 200 years or so, but they started putting vagrants and people with basically mental health problems into these leprosaria, and it changed from charity to punishment and control,
Yeah.
that they needed to be punished. And so, for example, in Paris, this was the birth of the asylum, basically. And in Paris, it was called the General Hospital, or the Hôpital Général. And whereas in around 1500, every European city had a wall around it and these gates, right? And so they were called the archers, and they would chase away all the vagrants, and they would chase them
Mhm.
out into the woods, and they were called the archers because they would chase them with bow and arrows, and then they would stand guards at the gates to make sure that they didn't come back into the city. 50 years later, when the general hospital opens up, they now were called the hospital archers, or the archers of the poor. They would go out into the countryside and find vagrants and bring them back and put them
Oh
into
my
the
god.
general hospital. That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing in the middle of the night when they come grab someone and put them in a van. This is the
Yeah.
history of, and then so the asylum existed like that, where they started in the around 1930s, started using lobotomies or electroconvulsive shock therapy or metrazole or diabetic comas, all of these horrible brain damaging therapeutics, they were called, until 1950, when Thorazine was brought to market, which was basically a lobotomy in a pill. And that was the sort of birth of modern psychopharmacology, and
Mhm.
which became a huge business. But the same spirit, that people had to be managed, that they were somehow defective, that they were broken, that they were, you know just of less value, and that these ideas persist, that there's something wrong with them, right? That they need to be more like
Mhm.
us.
And it's totally deflection. It's like
Yeah.
if they're not me, then I'm not associating with these issues. They don't resonate with me. It's totally a deflection thing, which is just so crazy because if you humanize and you validate and you relate to these experiences, the other person is so much better off, and but you would be accepting that you have the same problems.
Well, exactly, and so that solution too, and still the sort of way we understand addiction today, which is that it's this chronic relapsing brain disease, doesn't take into account the sort of context out of which addiction rises. We're starting to learn about adverse childhood experiences. We're starting to look at social determinants of health. And so my book originally was going to be to kind of promote these new emerging ideas. I mean, they're 20 years old now.
Mhm.
And then if you think about it too, I mean, even Freud was talking about the way our parents give us complexes.
Yeah.
And what I realized as I'm writing this is that's not enough. That yes, that's a big part of it, but there's something more. And so the ingredient that I added to the problem of addiction and how I understand addiction is I believe it's closely related to the disenchantment of the world, and that we live in this really sick world, and that you just pointed it out that it's a deflection. So addicts became the scapegoats because that's what the lepers were, right?
Yeah.
We were able to put all of our kind of problems on them, like they're the sick ones, they're the ones with the problems, they're the ones attracting God's wrath. And thank God it isn't us. Obviously we're the good ones, we're the ones God
Mhm.
loves. And that tradition, I mean, goes way back. Obviously, it's an ancient tradition where they would literally put all the sins of the community onto a goat ritualistically and send it out into the desert. And they were somehow redeemed and cleansed of this negativity. What's interesting actually is the Greek word pharmakon for drug means both, it means medicine, it means poison, and it means scapegoat. They all come from the same root word. So this is the idea that Paracelsus, the alchemist, says that the sort of poison is in the dose or the medicine is in the dose. That one substance, take alcohol for example, could be therapeutic in one dose and totally fatal in another dose. But
Mhm.
that scapegoating is this kind of ritualistic spell. I mean, it's a spell that you kind of it's like a kind of sympathetic magic that is supposed
Yeah.
to help us, but that we're scapegoating the wrong people.
Mhm.
And as we kind of create this paradise, say America is this utopia, and we're creating this paradise. Well, everyone who doesn't fit in, who's poor or who's a person of color or who's mentally ill, which are these categories that we created hundreds of years ago or more, that they don't fit into our paradise, that we keep having to build these gulags and these prisons. This was a
Mhm.
concept Milan Kundera came up with, that within the concept of paradise is kind of the hell or the gulag, because we keep excluding these people. And
Yeah.
so those walls around those cities and the leprosaria, we have to go back so far. So the last time we were kind of sane as a
Mhm.
culture, I mean, frankly, we might have to go back thousands of years in order to get there. But it's crucial that we question everything about the way we live together, and really who's good and who's bad and who's healthy and who's sick.
Mhm.
It's frankly, it's this. Alexis and I just watched the Matrix over the
Mhm.
weekend, and honestly, I hadn't watched it in 20 years, but that's what this is. And it's that shock of waking up to kind of who we are, which is the process of recovery, right? Where we learn to kind of, I guess, accept ourselves and understand our darkness or whatever that is. Well, this is what America needs to do. We need to kind of wake up to the fact that we're not who we think we are. And it can be shocking, but it's crucial. It's crucial that
Mhm.
we accept ourselves in full.
Yeah. So I have two follow-up questions.
Mm.
One being when all of these super unethical treatments are being instituted historically, whether it's lobotomies or over medication, transmedical stimulation, like all these kinds of things, asylums, is there clinical evidence at this point that's like, okay, maybe this is working? Or is it people
Well,
are
there
just
always was. I mean, each time one of these new techniques was invented,
Mhm.
it was the thing. And only when a new thing was invented did we kind of say, "Oh, no, no, we didn't quite have that right. Now we
Yeah.
know this is the thing." But as far as like the therapeutic community model, what's interesting is there was no research that it ever worked, and in fact, there was plenty of research that it didn't. It's more like a feeling. One study showed that it isn't even necessarily that a program has that philosophy, that violent kind of punitive therapeutic community model. You don't even need that. You could have a fancy Malibu treatment center, but you could have staff who believe that people need to be punished, that we're
Yeah.
sending the wrong message, that that we're rewarding bad behavior, that we need to break them down before we can build them up. All of these ideas are either part of the program, or they're just part of what the people who work in those programs, because they've been through recovery, because what was so funny is AA rejecting Chuck Diedrich. It's kind of like rejecting their own shadow, maybe, that
Yeah.
those things we don't want to admit about ourselves. Well, it'll come back and bite you. It's like a double-edged knife. You're cutting a piece of, you know, bread or meat with a knife, and it's
Mhm.
cutting into your hand.
Yeah.
So it'll come back, and that's what's happened to AA. And that Synanon model, the Chuck Diedrich model, really poisoned AA, where you have this very controlling sponsorship, like, I want you to call me before you brush your teeth in the morning, and it's this kind of weird, like
Mhm.
almost S&M type relationship.
Yeah.
Which, hey, if someone's into that, that's cool. But I think a lot of the people who are involved in it just think, well, this is just the way it is. Well, no,
Yeah.
the way it is when Bill Wilson came to talk to Dr. Bob, who reluctantly agreed to hear this guy out for 15 minutes. He told his wife,
Mhm.
I'll listen to him for 15 minutes. And Bill Wilson came and just talked with him. He didn't lecture him. He didn't tell him he needed to do anything different than what he was doing. And they ended up talking for hours, and the rest was history. And it was really just them meeting as equals and talking. And I mean, they got into cool stuff. They were into seances and the I Ching, and Bill Wilson was into psychedelic drugs and niacin and all this
Mhm.
stuff. So, I don't think people realize really what, and really, what AA was a branch of the New Thought movement, and about the
Yeah.
mind cure movement and things like that, and about the power of our mind to heal, and
Totally.
really about the power of fellowship and community. So anyway, I have lots of ideas about these things, but there was no greater kind of poison in the treatment world than Synanon and the therapeutic community model. And in fact, all of the research shows that more empathetic, more kind of non-directive, non-controlling techniques, and the therapeutic bond itself, more than any particular modality, is what creates good outcomes.
This week's episode is sponsored by Teen Counseling. I cannot tell you guys how many DMs, texts, emails I get from teens, parents, even friends asking, how can I find a therapist? How can I enroll in therapy? How can I find a therapist for my teen? How do I tell my parents I want to go to therapy? That's why I'm partnering with Teen Counseling. Teen Counseling is an online therapy program with over 14,000 licensed therapists in their network. They offer support on things like depression, anxiety, relationships, trauma, and more, and it's all targeted at teens. They offer text, talk, and video counseling. So no matter what level of support you're looking for, they got you. You're going to go to teencounseling.com/shepersisted. You'll fill out a quick survey about what your goals are for therapy, whether that's improving your mental health during the pandemic, working on your relationship with your parents, improving self-esteem, whatever it is, they'll match you with therapists that fit your needs. You'll enter your information and your parents' information. Your parents will get a super discreet email saying your child is interested in working with a licensed therapist at teencounseling.com. They head to the website, learn a little bit more about the program, and approve you to work with a therapist. And from there, you can meet with that therapist on a frequency that works for you. This is a great way to dip your toe into the therapy world and get support when you need it without having to go into an office, meet with a therapist, meet with a stranger, and go through all of that for the first time. So you can go to teencounseling.com/shepersisted. Again, that's teencounseling.com/shepersisted to get started today. Yeah, it's really interesting when you're talking about the treatment programs and how it's not necessarily the philosophies and values of the program themselves, but maybe the staff that work there. And that totally resonates because when I was at a therapeutic boarding school in Montana, I even since then going back and talking to the different people that run the program or our higher up staff, even when I was there, those relationships were very authentic. The intentions were there. They had the so much compassion and care for these kids. And I always said, like, if this staff member was every staff member, there wouldn't be an issue. But the people that are spending 10 to 12 hours a day at a time with the girls 24/7 who are severely struggling are coming out of high school with a graduation barely a graduation looking for a minimum wage job in the middle of nowhere 5 minutes south of the Canadian
Yeah.
border because that's the only place that's hiring. And so
And you've heard
it's
of the Stanford prison experiment, right?
yeah,
Which
yeah,
they had to shut down after a few weeks because it got way out of hand
it
and
was
super
so bad.
violent.
Hmm.
There's something, and again, I don't think it's because humans are necessarily violent and controlling. I think it's within us. We've obviously had to survive historically and from an evolutionary point of view, but I think way more than that, we've been communal, we've been empathetic,
Hmm.
and these things. But that there's this, again, because we don't accept within ourselves, like, I mean, America, which I love, has a violent history. There's a history of
Yeah.
violence here. And until we admit that about ourselves, it pops up in the weirdest places. And of course,
Mhm.
it's going to pop up in the sort of mental health treatment world and addiction world because these are, again, historically the people who've been excluded or exiled or devalued. So they're the most vulnerable, or children often too, right? Again, it's poor people and children. These are the people we've
Mhm.
decided it's okay to basically treat like animals.
That was my exact follow-up question, which is, we've made progress in many other aspects of the mental health industry, just taking that one example of people being exiled and excluded. Why is it still okay that and why do we as a society deem it okay for treatment for the either the impoverished or adolescents to be conducted that way?
Yeah, so I think, and this is one thing I discovered writing the book, is that it's a bit of a myth that we move from the moral failure model, that it's kind of this singular line that we move from the moral failure model to the brain disease model, which, you know, makes sense. That's, I guess, an improvement, that we're
Mhm.
supposed to treat people with a disease compassionately, like they have
Yeah.
diabetes or cancer. That's the idea. So when you unpack this, though, it's actually a little more interesting than that. If you look at it, we still treat it as a moral failing, where you look at the prison population and something like 20% of people in prison still to today are in for drug charges. I'm sure it's another 20, 30, 40%. I don't have the figures in front of me, but who are in there either to get money for drugs or who were under the influence of a drug while they committed their crime. I mean,
Yeah.
drugs are expensive because they're illegal. They call that the prohibition price, which only really
Mhm.
serves drug dealers. It creates this huge profit
The whole economy,
incentive. The
it's
whole the
yeah,
whole drug economy is based on prohibition. If you made them drugs legal tomorrow,
it
that
would
would
collapse.
it would collapse.
Mhm.
And I'm sure there would still be black markets, but you would see a huge decrease in the sort of theft and criminality that often goes
Mhm.
along with
And the
this,
violence as well. We
and the
hear
violence
about yeah.
and the violence. So okay, so we've just proven basically that we have both a moral failure model and a disease model. But then you look at the disease model. If I have a chronic relapsing brain disease, that's kind of like a sentence in its own right. Like I can't like fix my brain. I can't like get in there, and
Yeah.
it's chronic and it's relapsing and I'll have it forever. I mean, even those first, it's so funny because AA helped kind of bring about this new enlightened perspective that of the disease model, which was an improvement. But they didn't maybe see that it was going to create just another trap, though, in a way. They're writing in their first edition of the book, like, we who have recovered, we want to show you how we recovered. Like, they're talking about having recovered. Nowadays, you go to an AA meeting, like, no, 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 whoa, whoa, whoa. You never recover. This is a lifelong thing.
Yes, we're addicts. Mhm.
We're addicts. And so, and this is where I would sort of even take issue with some of the adverse childhood experience, sort of social determinants. Not that those things aren't true, those things are true, but that's just behaviorism. That's just sort of stimulus response. That's environmental determinism. So now, whether it's medical, biological determinism or environmental determinism, so
Mhm.
even the way out of biological determinism is the environmental determinism. There's always determinism. So how do we ever recover then? And
Yeah.
we know from experience, people recover through this miraculous revelation. I mean, I don't know why people recover. There's no other way to describe it, but it's a
Mhm.
miracle. And it involves community, it involves some kind of surrender, it involves all these things that have nothing to do with medicine, or very little to do with morals. I mean, the people I know who are kids. I know Maya Salovitz takes issue with the fact that in AA you do a moral inventory, that you wouldn't have someone with cancer or diabetes have to do a moral inventory. I think that's kind of
And that's such a big part of adolescent treatment is the accountability letter. You get in, you write this
right.
giant letter of everything you've done wrong, and you read it to your parents.
You're a
Such
teenager. You're a
yeah.
teenager. You did nothing wrong. You did
Yeah.
nothing wrong. So we pathologize everything, which is why, again, I don't like the disease model. So we pathologize. What do they call it for adolescents? Like conduct disorder or
Mhm.
oppositional defiance. We're
Yeah.
pathologizing normal teen rebelliousness.
Mhm.
It's normal. There's
Yeah.
nothing wrong. And our again, addiction and mental health problems, they don't occur out of a vacuum. They're not genetic. They occur
Mhm.
out of a context. They occur out of family systems, which when you're talking about young people, when you're talking about our childhoods, that's that's really not something we're responsible for.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that blaming our parents is the key, because frankly, they're just going to blame their parents. We're going to blame their parents. They're going to blame their parents.
Mhm.
But at least we've kind of see like, oh, I see where this started. I see these
Yeah.
patterns. I see how I'm repeating these patterns because those were my role models. Like, oh, I see. So what I think is we're getting to a new kind of frontier. So we've gone through the moral failure model, we've gone through the disease model, we've we're kind of rushing through the social determinant model, which includes those family systems even. And I think
Mhm.
we're getting to something even more transcendent, even more powerful, which is turning around and changing these things. Like
Mhm.
we can change our family, we can change the world, we can change the conditions that lead to so much suffering. I literally just in the last probably couple of months have have had a major change myself centered
Mhm.
around the idea that 99.9% of suffering in the world is totally avoidable.
Yeah.
And people like take issue with it. And it's so funny because it's almost like people are going to try to police my imagination. Like you're not allowed to think that, or you're not allowed to say that. Like I honestly, wholeheartedly believe. I literally up until a couple of months ago, I would have said, "Well, life is suffering. There's a certain suffering of
Mhm.
life. Like there's a certain amount of pain that's normal." Like I honestly don't believe that anymore. I don't believe
Yeah.
it. It's all avoidable. We all create so much, we cause so much pain. We've suffered from pain, but I mean, the real pain of the world is occurring in neighborhoods we've probably never been to, parts of the world most of us have probably never been to, that we're all intricately connected to. I mean, there's kids here in Los Angeles who go to bed hungry in one of the
Yeah.
richest cities in the richest country in the world. And I also happen to believe in something called open individualism, that we're not actually just separate individuals, but that we're actually one being, one
Mhm.
organism kind of experiencing itself subjectively from different points of view. So, my feeling is if there's kids starving in Yemen or in Los Angeles, that I feel that pain. I actually believe that a lot of the pain of the world, a lot of our addiction problems are caused by the fact that that is us.
Yeah,
And
and it's
it's
so heightened by the level of news we're constantly consuming. You
right,
can understand why stress rates rise, anxiety rates rise, because if you go back 200 years, you wouldn't have been hearing about all of these different things that are going on daily. It
right.
makes sense. It's just amplified.
Well, and I believe though that those are signals like that in the same way like Johann Hari says that addiction or sorry, well addiction, but that depression and anxiety are signals like that they would have been evolutionary signals like if we were separated from our tribe, we would have felt
Yeah.
depressed and anxious and that would have motivated us to find our way back.
Mhm.
I believe in the same way that the earth is talking to us through the
Yeah.
media perhaps, and it is so chaotic, but there's a way to make sense of it, that if we have like a conceptual framework that basically says, you know, what children shouldn't suffer. You can be super basic about it. Children shouldn't suffer. We shouldn't mistreat women, and everyone
Mhm.
should be clothed, fed, and housed because we have
Mhm.
the ability and the resources to be able to do that. So that's like your starting point, and that
Yeah.
we live in a community. It's a huge 8 billion person community, but it's a
Mhm.
community and it's all connected. It's like that family system, and it's
Yeah.
not occurring in these sort of little isolated
Vacuums,
uh,
yeah.
vacuums that we normally or have been taught to imagine ourselves as being. So yes, however disturbing the news is, I think it's important. I actually happen to think journalists are doing God's work,
Yeah.
trying to give voice in the same way that scientists with their instruments are telling us, like, we're seeing some really disturbing things. They have to do it in this really kind of like detached, dispassionate way.
Yeah.
My hair would be on fire and I'd be, screaming from the rooftops. Like, we need to change now. And I see a lot of positive things, but I believe we won't solve the addiction and mental health problems until we solve these kind of larger problems. We just won't. We won't. And that drugs don't cause addiction. That something like less than 1% of, we were blaming big pharma. We're always looking for kind of things to point our fingers to, and we're missing the bigger picture. That less than 1% of people who get prescribed opioids, for example, who didn't already have a substance use problem, become dependent on those drugs. So it's none of the things we thought it was. It's none of the
Yeah.
things we thought it was.
It's crazy. So before we go into kind of navigating adolescent addiction and kind of steps you can take to work through that, I want to quickly ask your opinion on wilderness therapy and that form of
Mm.
treatment because I feel it's a very interesting perspective to add to the show as I've had a couple girls on that went through that themselves.
Well, this is part of, you mean the therapeutic community, sort of boot camp, tough
Yeah,
love.
so the gooning where your parents watch as 2 men come into your room and they pick you up, they put you in a van, they take you to Utah, Montana, Colorado,
Right.
these places, and then you carry on your back a tarp filled with the spoon you whittled and your sticks you used to make your fire so you can earn the privilege of dinner that night with young adults that have graduated college and love being in the woods. You see a therapist that doesn't necessarily have their doctorate once a week and you're there for 6 to 8 weeks with no contact, no clothing, well, you have the one pair of outfit that they give you, but no shelter, no parents,
Yeah.
no contact, and then you leave and you're often sent to therapeutic boarding schools or residentials or other long-term treatment.
I think it should be illegal.
Yeah.
I think it should be outlawed entirely. What's interesting is like a lot of things, it's so close to being like there is something there,
Yeah.
and that
It's like
that's
you breaking down the hierarchy of needs, you can see why someone could build up healthier connections and healthier
yeah.
ways to get that love and belonging,
And
but it's slightly missing the mark.
nature's
Yeah.
good.
Mhm,
Rites of passage. What happened to all the
mhm.
rites of passage and initiations? Like, there's a
Yeah.
role for something that looks kind of like that, but that's the shadow. And again,
You're missing the willingness, the choice to go, all of
right.
these
Well,
things
like
that make it a successful experience.
consent, being
Yeah.
probably the most important thing, because I'm sure how many young people would want to do that. Like, hey, or it's how you presented it. It's like, hey, we've been living in this part of the world so wrong, we've become so disconnected, and how would you like an opportunity to go, connect with others, to connect with nature,
Mhm.
to learn about yourself, to learn about the world, and through philosophy and storytelling, and that you could have a situation that was challenging but that didn't need to be cruel. So it's all these little nuances, and it's because the people who are delivering those programs aren't right with themselves. They
Yeah.
don't know themselves, and they don't know their own. They think they're doing good. They don't believe
Yeah.
that they're capable of violence and abuse, which is exactly what
Mhm.
they're doing.
Mhm. And they're told
So
they're doing good. They're
right.
constantly reinforced by families, and I think it's also a really interesting thing, kind of like Stockholm syndrome-esque, where these girls come out of this and they're transformed.
Yeah.
They believed it saved their lives because when they were at home, they were miserable. They
Yeah.
were isolated. They were navigating all these things which were somehow worse than this
Yeah.
experience in the middle of the woods.
Imagine you could have all these young people going to like plant trees and like,
Yeah.
saving the world. Like, there's so many
Volunteering. Mhm.
volunteering, so like the Peace Corps. There's so many
Mhm.
great opportunities that would have all of the positive benefits with none of the violence and abuse that
And
that
so
is
much
so
less expensive.
right.
Like, there's no need for the $100,000
There's
for
not.
those 18 weeks there, however long you're there.
There's
It's
not.
it's insane.
And so, yeah, I think, we're missing rites of passage. We're missing kind of those initiatory rituals and things like that. But no, I'm definitely not a fan. I would do whatever I could to help, raise awareness around it. And thank
Yeah.
you for you doing that. If you ever need my help, or if you want to go, I think we should actually go to these places and like liberate the kids
That's what
Uh,
Paris Hilton did. She went and she
yeah,
stood at the exact school that she attended where she was isolated and physically abused and
yeah,
malnourished and saw all this kind of stuff, and she went back with hundreds of people. They
yeah.
stood outside with their microphones, and they told their stories, and it's still there. The
We should
kids
do
were still
more of that. Yeah,
inside
we
and
need to do more of that. And so again, it's until we can see that the homeless people on the street likely grew up in conditions that would break most of us. They're living in a car with their mom,
mhm,
or who was running from an abusive boyfriend or husband, who they're then given a choice to go to a homeless shelter, which are dangerous places, unsafe, where they're not allowed to bring stuff, where they have to leave in the morning, where there's abuse and violence going on as well, as opposed to an actual home, like an actual apartment that's
mhm.
safe, that they can lock the door, things that anyone
Takes for
wants,
granted,
takes for
yeah.
granted. So until,
Mhm.
but at least we've kind of see, like, oh, I see where this started. I see these
Yeah.
patterns. I see how I'm repeating these patterns because those were my role models. Like, oh, I see. So what I think is we're getting to a new kind of frontier. So we've gone through the moral failure model, we've gone through the disease model, we've we're kind of rushing through the social determinant model, which includes those family systems even. And I think
Mhm,
we're getting to something even more transcendent, even more powerful, which is turning around and changing these things. Like
mhm.
we can change our family, we can change the world, we can change the conditions that lead to so much suffering. I literally just in the last probably couple of months have have had a major change myself, centered
Mhm.
around the idea that 99.9% of suffering in the world is totally avoidable.
Yeah.
And people like take issue with it. And it's so funny because it's almost like people are going to try to police my imagination. Like you're not allowed to think that, or you're not allowed to say that. Like I honestly, wholeheartedly believe. I literally up until a couple of months ago, I would have said, "Well, life is suffering. There's a certain suffering of
Mhm.
life. Like there's a certain amount of pain that's normal." Like I honestly don't believe that anymore. I don't believe
Yeah.
it. It's all avoidable. We all create so much, we cause so much pain. We've suffered from pain, but I mean, the real pain of the world is occurring in neighborhoods we've probably never been to, parts of the world most of us have probably never been to, that we're all intricately connected to. I mean, there's kids here in Los Angeles who go to bed hungry in one of the
Yeah.
richest cities in the richest country in the world. And I also happen to believe in something called open individualism, that we're not actually just separate individuals, but that we're actually one being, one
Mhm.
organism kind of experiencing itself subjectively from different points of view. So my feeling is if there's kids starving in Yemen or in Los Angeles, that I feel that pain. I actually believe that a lot of the pain of the world, a lot of our addiction problems are caused by the fact that that is us.
Yeah,
And
and it's
it's
so heightened by the level of news we're constantly consuming. You
right,
can understand why stress rates rise, anxiety rates rise, because if you go back 200 years, you wouldn't have been hearing about all of these different things that are going on daily. It
right.
makes sense. It's just amplified.
Well, and I believe though that those are signals, like that, in the same way like Johann Hari says that addiction, or sorry, well, addiction, but that depression and anxiety are signals, like that they would have been evolutionary signals. Like if we were separated from our tribe, we would have felt
Yeah.
depressed and anxious, and that would have motivated us to find our way back.
Mhm.
I believe in the same way that the earth is talking to us through the
Yeah.
media perhaps, and it is so chaotic, but there's a way to make sense of it, that if we have like a conceptual framework that basically says, you know, what children shouldn't suffer. You can be super basic about it. Children shouldn't suffer. We shouldn't mistreat women, and everyone
Mhm.
should be clothed, fed, and housed because we have
Mhm.
the ability and the resources to be able to do that. So that's like your starting point, and that
Yeah.
we live in a community. It's a huge 8 billion person community, but it's a
Mhm.
community and it's all connected. It's like that family system, and it's
Yeah.
not occurring in these sort of little isolated
Vacuums,
uh,
yeah.
vacuums that we normally or have been taught to imagine ourselves as being. So yes, however disturbing the news is, I think it's important. I actually happen to think journalists are doing God's work,
Yeah.
trying to give voice in the same way that scientists with their instruments are telling us, like, we're seeing some really disturbing things. They have to do it in this really kind of like detached, dispassionate way.
Yeah.
My hair would be on fire and I'd be, screaming from the rooftops. Like, we need to change now. And I see a lot of positive things, but I believe we won't solve the addiction and mental health problems until we solve these kind of larger problems. We just won't. We won't. And that drugs don't cause addiction. That something like less than 1% of, we were blaming big pharma. We're always looking for kind of things to point our fingers to, and we're missing the bigger picture. That less than 1% of people who get prescribed opioids, for example, who didn't already have a substance use problem, become dependent on those drugs. So it's none of the things we thought it was. It's none of the
Yeah.
things we thought it was.
It's crazy. So before we go into kind of navigating adolescent addiction and kind of steps you can take to work through that, I want to quickly ask your opinion on wilderness therapy and that form of
Mm.
treatment because I feel it's a very interesting perspective to add to the show as I've had a couple girls on that went through that themselves.
Well, this is part of, you mean the therapeutic community, sort of boot camp, tough
Yeah,
love.
so the gooning where your parents watch as two men come into your room and they pick you up, they put you in a van, they take you to Utah, Montana, Colorado, these places, and then you carry on your back a tarp filled with the spoon you whittled and your sticks you used to make your fire so you can earn the privilege of dinner that night with young adults that have graduated college and love being in the woods. You see a therapist that doesn't necessarily have their doctorate once a week and you're there for 6 to 8 weeks with no contact, no clothing, no well, you have the one pair of outfit that they give you, but no shelter, no parents,
Yeah.
no contact, and then you leave and you're often sent to therapeutic boarding schools or residentials or other long-term treatment.
I think it should be illegal.
Yeah.
I think it should be outlawed entirely. What's interesting is like a lot of things, it's so close to being like there is something there,
Yeah.
and that
It's like
that's
you breaking down the hierarchy of needs, you can see why someone could build up healthier connections and healthier
yeah.
ways to get that love and belonging,
And
but it's slightly
nature,
missing the mark.
nature's
Yeah.
good.
Mhm.
Rites of passage. What happened to all the
Mhm.
rites of passage and initiations? Like, there's a
Yeah.
role for something that looks kind of like that, but that's the shadow. And again,
You're missing the willingness, the choice to go, all of
right.
these
Well,
things
like
that make it a successful experience.
consent, being
Yeah.
being probably the most important thing, because I'm sure how many young people would want to do that. Like, hey, or it's how you presented it. It's like, hey, we've been living in this part of the world so wrong, we've become so disconnected, and how would you like an opportunity to go, connect with others, to connect with nature,
Mhm.
to learn about yourself, to learn about the world, and through philosophy and storytelling, and that you could have a situation that was challenging but that didn't need to be cruel. So it's all these little nuances, and it's because the people who are delivering those programs aren't right with themselves. They
Yeah.
don't know themselves, and they don't know their own. They think they're doing good. They don't believe
Yeah.
that they're capable of violence and abuse, which is exactly what
Mhm.
they're doing.
Mhm. And they're told
So
they're doing good, they're constantly
right.
reinforced by families, and I think it's also a really interesting thing, kind of like Stockholm Syndrome-esque, where these girls come out of this and they're transformed.
Yeah.
They believed it saved their lives because when they were at home, they were miserable, they
Yeah.
were isolated, they were navigating all these things which were somehow worse than this
Yeah.
experience in the middle of the woods.
Imagine you could have all these young people going to like plant trees and like,
Yeah.
saving the world. Like, there's so many
Volunteering. Mhm.
volunteering, so like the Peace Corps. There's so many
Mhm.
great opportunities that would have all of the positive benefits with none of the violence and abuse that
And
that
so
is
much
so
less expensive.
right.
Like, there's no need for the $100,000
There's
for
not.
those 18 weeks there, however long you're there.
There's
It's
not.
it's insane.
And so, yeah, I think, we're missing rites of passage. We're missing kind of those initiatory rituals and things like that. But no, I'm definitely not a fan. I would do whatever I could to help, raise awareness around it. And thank
Yeah.
you for you doing that. If you ever need my help, if you want to go, I think we should actually go to these places and like liberate the kids.
That's what
Uh,
Paris Hilton did. She went and she
yeah,
stood at the exact school that she attended where she was isolated and physically abused and
yeah,
malnourished and saw all this kind of stuff, and she went back with hundreds of people. They
yeah.
stood outside with their microphones and they told their stories, and it's still there. The
We should
kids
do
were still
more of that. Yeah,
inside
we
and
need to do more of that. And so again, it's until we can see that the homeless people on the street likely grew up in conditions that would break most of us. They're living in a car with their mom,
mhm,
or who was running from an abusive boyfriend or husband, who they're then given a choice to go to a homeless shelter, which are dangerous places, unsafe, where they're not allowed to bring stuff, where they have to leave in the morning, where there's abuse and violence going on as well, as opposed to an actual home, like an actual apartment that's
mhm.
safe, that they can lock the door, things that anyone
Takes for
wants,
granted,
takes for
yeah.
granted. So until so much, and so it's never too late. Things always change. Things just
Mhm,
stick around, and things will change. And the best advice I could, and I know how hard it is. It's different than my generation, Gen X. It was different for millennials, and I know it's even harder for the newest generation. But if you can become independent, where we're not dependent on our parents, where there can be all those unhealthy strings attached to almost everything, that in its own right is very liberating. Where we can't kind of be criticized or controlled because we're autonomous. I mean, we're autonomous within a community, and we have our own responsibilities and accountabilities, but we're not kind of beholden to parents who might not be ready to kind of make that leap themselves, and to kind of, it's very humbling. It's very humbling to have to admit that you might have got it wrong.
yeah. Yeah, it's for so many, it's their worst fear to have done your child wrong or misled them or
Yeah,
made a mistake, and
right.
so it's completely understandable why that's the scariest thing to admit that, and it's downhill from that point when you admit that and you can move forward and repair the relationship rather than continuing
It's
on the path
easy
that
after
you're
that. I
on.
mean, it's downhill in the sense
Mhm.
that you're just coasting. Like, they
Yeah.
think that they're going to catch on fire if they admit that they made a mistake, but really they're going to be free. Like, that's again how this isn't kind of an individual isolated thing. It's a
Mhm.
system thing. So the young person hopefully sparks this conversation, shakes the matrix a little bit, I suppose, and
Mhm.
that the parent kind of takes the opportunity to themselves also open themselves and kind of become vulnerable and become fluid and ready to change. Like, there are big kind of earth changes, I think, way beyond our control. And the fact is, and that's scary for people. They don't like to
Mhm.
admit that they're out of control, or that it's right up there with having got it wrong. Like, I've got it all wrong and I'm not in control. I mean,
Yeah.
there's forces at work, I think, in the earth that are trying to kind of wake us up, and it's very disturbing. And though the nice thing is, once we're awake, it becomes much easier to deal, even like with that information you were talking about. Like, it fits, like,
Mhm.
look at, I feel the suffering of the world. We become open to that, but it doesn't destroy me. It just, if anything, it just gives me more motivation to fight, and to fight for what's right, and to fight for what I believe in, and to speak my mind. And I think that that's the most important thing. I think talking about kind of open individualism, if we understand that we are not just our isolated selves, but that we are everything, we are kind of the whole universe experiencing itself, we're not like afraid of dying anymore. Like, we're not
Yeah.
afraid of anything. So
Mhm.
that's this huge empowering sense that we get. Now, the flip side is that we feel the pain of the world. That's the trade off.
Yeah.
That when we were imagining we were isolated individuals, all we felt was our own pain. We couldn't quite put our finger on where it was coming from. Because again, I think it's coming from way beyond that boundary we created for
Yeah.
ourselves. But we open ourselves to all kinds of things, and to amazing opportunities, and to be part of this thing that is so much bigger than ourselves. And that's meaning, that's love, that's all the things in life that actually matter.
Absolutely. I think that's the perfect place to kind of wrap it up and kind of let people have a really strong takeaway to go with. But thank you so much for joining me. This is one of the most phenomenal episodes I've recorded, and then so many takeaways for teens and parents and anyone that's looking to change their life for the better and really build that life worth living. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sadie. Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Of course. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please share with a friend, family member, or post about it on social media. Make sure you're subscribed to the show so you don't miss any future episodes, and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to let me know what you think. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Friday.